Thank you, Lucia. And thank you everyone for inviting me to this webinar from across the Atlantic Ocean. My background is in what in the UK we call psychosocial studies, which is a refusal to just accept psychology as about the individual without situating the individual within society. And so psychosocial studies is trying to look at the constant two-way traffic between the individual psyche on the one hand and structures of power and aspects of culture and so on within the society at the other. So that's my background. And I left university where I'd set up a Centre for Psychosocial Studies about 7 years ago now, because I trained also as a psychotherapist. So I currently work as a psychotherapist, and about 12 years ago, I, with a network of others, activists in the Bristol area, began to develop something that later became the Climate Psychology Alliance. And the Climate Psychology Alliance is an NGO comprising clinical psychologists, researchers, activists, psychotherapists and counsellors, primarily, which has been working around these issues of change. How do we accomplish change within society, both at individual group and political levels? And so what I'm going to talk to you about today is a particular kind of workshop that we've been running for probably 15 years or more now, originally developed by a colleague of mine called Rosemary Randall, and it's where she called it Carbon Conversations, which is about how do you have these difficult conversations with friends, family, colleagues, neighbors about the climate change issue. How do you have these conversations? If you're interested in change and accomplishing change, particularly at a local level, so we start locally and think globally, yes, how do you begin to have these kinds of conversations with people? And we talk about it in terms of conversations. We don't talk about it in terms of communication, because communication tends to be a one-way thing. Communication tends to be about telling and talking. Whereas we believe strongly, and this is very much based on our experience from the psychotherapy world, that you have to engage people in dialogue, conversations, in order to achieve change. And so what I'm going to do today is take you through a workshop that I've been running with parents groups, with Extinction Rebellion groups, which is about how do you go about engaging people in these difficult conversations about climate change. So I'm going to take you through the slides that we will use in a typical workshop very quickly, because I don't have time to explain it in great detail. Suffice to say that these workshops will typically be between 20 and 60 people. We believe it's best to do it face-to-face, because online you cannot provide the kind of time and support that people need to work through some of these difficult emotional issues. And we normally, when we run these workshops, will run them with two facilitators rather than just a single person, because particularly if you've got a large number of people, it's quite difficult to manage. So we normally have a slide presentation, which I'll share with you, the one I use most recently. But we will, during that presentation, break the participation up so that people are working in pairs at times, or working in small groups at times, so that it's not just being talked at by us. So it's an interactive workshop that we're actually running. And just before I put these slides up, let me just say two other things. Climate Psychology Alliance has a kind of set of, I suppose, fairly fundamental beliefs. First of all, that the way in which people engage with climate change issues or don't engage is to do with both their thoughts and their feelings. And you have to have a way of addressing both of those things together. So it's a challenge to traditional cognitivist and behaviorist ways of thinking about change. Secondly, we also believe as a network that the self is actually a complex and non-unitary thing, so that one part of the self may believe one thing and another part of the self may believe another. And you have to understand and work with that complex idea of what we would call a non-unitary self. Thirdly, and this has already been talked about by Sergio to some extent, that the importance of dealing with feelings, and this will come through in the slides I present in a minute, is that feelings are the basis of motivation. If people don't feel something, they won't be motivated to act. So that's why feelings alongside thoughts are impossible, have to be considered. And finally, the final thing that will come out in the slides is that we are dealing with complex defenses. When we talk about, for example, denial, we are dealing with a kind of way individuals and groups have of defending themselves from difficult and often painful feelings, such as despair or guilt, and so on. So they're the kind of fundamental assumptions that we have as the Climate Psychology Alliance. So let me just share my screen with you now and bring up this presentation. Can you see that now? Is that visible? Yeah, good. Okay, so this is the workshop that I've been running, and it's called Taking the Heat Out of Climate Conversations. All right? So it's recognizing that these conversations are difficult. And the thing I often say to people is, it's a bit like talking about race, which is also a difficult conversation to have. Yeah. And the first thing that I introduce in the workshop is the important role that feelings play in all of this. We very strongly believe that the problem of climate communication is not about information deficit. The information deficit model, we feel, has been discredited a long time ago. The crucial issue is to also work on the feelings as well as the information, knowledge, and cognition. And we struggle against these powerful feelings elicited by climate change. And then I'll talk through with them some of those difficult feelings and use very often, me and my other co-facilitator will give personal examples, for example, of the way in which despair, for example, affects us. So we try and personalize this as much as we can during the workshop, rather than making it abstract. So we introduce, these are the kind of key feelings involved in climate change denial, why we try and protect ourselves from these things. And then I introduce the idea of soft denial, what we would call soft denial. Not hard denial, not the kind of psychotic refusal to see what's in your face. But our argument is that most people engage in what we would call soft denial, yeah? Where people know the facts, they're aware fully of the facts, particularly in countries in Europe and North America. You cannot avoid knowing about this issue. So we know the facts, but we know it in a particular kind of way in which it doesn't create any emotional disturbance sense of urgency, or motivation to act. And this in the psychotherapy world, we call disavowal. Yeah? It's a very common phenomenon, disavowal, whereby reality is simultaneously accepted and denied. Yeah? Classic, loads of research and examples of this from the experience of the Holocaust, yeah, decades ago. So we introduced them to this idea of soft denial or disavowal, and then some of the dimensions of it, which some of you I'm sure will be very familiar with. So perceptual distortion, cherry picking information, selective inattention, trying to know as little as possible about these difficult issues by turning off the television when something about the environment comes on, diffusion of responsibility. Someone else will do something about this. We don't have to do something. And rationalization. And then I'll talk about some of the examples of rationalization, what I call the internal propaganda of ordinary denial. They, the scientists, will come up with something. What's the point of doing anything? It's the Chinese or the Americans' fault, and so on and so forth. And then normally, having gone through this slide, I will stop. And I will then say to the audience, okay, what I want you to do, working in pairs, choose someone you don't know in the audience, work in pairs, 10, 15 minutes, just talking about how do I do denial? Yeah. How do I do it? Because we all do it. Yeah. Even the most accomplished climate scientist will have to do this kind of denial at times in order to stay sane. So how do I do this kind of denial? So they work then 10, 15 minutes in pairs, and then we start again with the presentation. So then we talk about the actual process of having these conversations. And what doesn't work? Well, we know that more facts don't work. It's not an, it's an information deficit model which has been discredited. Entering a conversation with an outcome in mind doesn't help. Yeah. And this comes very much from Extinction Rebellion. They have this very strong view that if you're going to engage with people, paradoxically, you mustn't engage with them with the idea that you're trying to persuade them. Because as soon as you do that, yeah, you close down the possibilities of real dialogue. So you enter the conversation without an outcome in mind. And then we talk about some of the other difficult things that often get in the way of an effective dialogue, like othering, you know, seeing this person you're trying to talk to, it might be a colleague at work, as somehow or other a hopeless case. What's the point in talking to him? He's obviously just a greedy, selfish individual, you know, in that way in which we other the other person. Then we introduce the idea of, again, I think someone's talked about this earlier, ethical dilemmas. Nobody approaches the complex issue of climate change without feeling these dilemmas. We're all caught up in it. Yeah, we're all part of the system. And so we experience exactly the same dilemmas as the person that we're trying to hold the conversation with. And I will often give an example at the end about love miles, what we call love miles. My daughter lives in Cambodia, where she runs a children's charity. Yeah. Do we go out to visit her, knowing that it's going to involve flying or not? That's the ethical dilemma that we face. Yeah. It's not a simple question. And everybody faces climate change through these kinds of dilemmas. So we explore these kinds of dilemmas with people. Okay. Then we start to introduce some basic principles about effective listening. Yeah. You don't have all the answers. You experience exactly the same dilemmas as your audience that you're trying to engage with. You also feel ambivalent and defensive and would like to bury your head in the sand. And I talk a bit about how you really need to own all the kinds of difficulties and resistances that you see in the friend or the member of your family or your colleague who you're trying to influence. And crucially, at the end, you don't occupy the moral high ground, because it's so easy in these conversations to get into that kind of holier than thou kind of virtue signaling. We then talk a little bit more about deep listening. People already know, they don't need persuading by you, the importance of identifying difficult feelings through the conversation that someone is wrestling with. Might be despair, for example, a very common one. Yeah. And crucially, at the end, the person that you're talking to must feel that they've been understood by you. Only then will they be open to new understandings. And that's a fundamental principle from the world of psychotherapy. Okay, then at that moment, we break them up again and start getting them to do some individual work, focusing on the skills of deep listening. In pairs, again, talking, we get each person in turn to talk about a particular ethical dilemma they face in relation to climate change. And then they have the experience of talking to another and listening to someone who's talking about this dilemma that they're trying to work through. So again, an interactive part of the workshop, getting people to learn about skills by doing them. Okay, then we offer some more thoughts about deep listening, how to stay curious about something. And for those of you here who are from an academic or research background, you'll know how important the value of curiosity is. What's the point of researching someone who is different to you and has different experiences to you if you can't be curious about them? Yeah. And how important it is to listen non-judgmentally in that way with respect and compassion. So we introduce some more elements of these deep listening skills. And then we'll talk about some of the difficulties of what we would call resistances, where you come across a bit of an impasse, where the other person you can feel is digging their heels in. They want to break down the conversation, or they're starting to be aggressive, or whatever it might be. And we talk about some of those typical resistances that you'll get in a conversation about the climate. Yeah. For example, exceptionalism is one that we often talk about, where someone believes in some sort of strange, omnipotent way that they are an exception. So the kinds of rules that apply to others, like, trying to reduce your carbon footprint, don't apply to them, because in some obscure, perhaps mystical way, they themselves are accepted from these kinds of rules that apply to everybody else. And we'll talk about some of the ways which are crucial in terms of working with those resistances. And in particular, this thing from judo. When you come across that in the person that you're trying to engage with, when you come across that resistance, don't go at it head on. Come from the side, yeah, as in judo, yeah, because that's how you deal with resistance in these difficult conversations. Okay, and then finally, what we will do in the workshop is then get them to do an extensive role play in which one person is the talker, one person is the listener or interviewer, if you like, and two people are observers, and then they'll rotate. Yeah. So they all get the experience of practicing their listening skills and then getting feedback from people who are observing this process. So that's how we do it. And that's the kind of approach that we've been taking. And my colleague, Rosemary, is now developing a new model with other colleagues in the Climate Psychology Alliance, which is called Living with the Climate Crisis. And so rather than a single workshop for one evening, this will now be in 7 sessions. And what they're hoping to do, what they are doing, is making available all the information, all the instructions, the kind of manual for people to use this kind of technology, making it freely available for people through the web on the Climate Psychology website. So that our idea all the time is to create new innovations in research, in consultancy, in forms of communication that can be freely available. We're an NGO, where we're not a private organization or anything like that. And our main goal and aim is to achieve change. So I'll stop there.